Alrighty, so we're getting a little bit deeper into Romans chapter 1 this morning, and we're opening up this subject that's called general revelation. So we're going to take about 3 Sundays to chop this subject up, and that pretty much takes us through the holidays and into January, actually. And so I hope that we can feel like we've explored this pretty thoroughly by the time that we're done here. And so general revelation is a specific kind of revelation from God. All right, special revelation is when God actually speaks to or through somebody. He gives them a message or a propositional statement or something like that. The Bible is an example of special revelation. So it's an actual verbal message that's transmitted to us through human agency. And general revelation is the ways that God reveals himself that are in a more general way, thus the name, and to a more general audience. And mainly the idea here is that you would not even need to read the Bible to know these things about God. And so general revelation is all over the place, and it's for all people. So last week, we talked about the good news. And we ended up in the middle of chapter 1 of Romans, and we already did this part, but in verse 16, Paul says, "For I am not ashamed of this good news about Christ. It is the power of God at work, rescuing everyone who believes, the Jew first, and also the Gentile." The good news tells us how God makes us right in his sight. And so the good news tells us how we can get right with God and how we can be acceptable to him, even though we may be pretty badly messed up. And even though we may be living in a way that is way short of the way that he would expect us to be living. And so he can accept us anyway because we're all just basically forgiven of everything, past, present, and future, that we do. And that's accomplished through the death of Jesus Christ. So God had to come in person through Christ. And so that's pretty much what we talked about last week. And then he says, this is accomplished from start to finish by faith. And so, what does God want from us? It's just this. All right, just trust that what he has done for you is good enough. Put your confidence in only that finished work of Christ. And then you and God can be together forever, and there will be no problem between you. As the scriptures say, it is through faith that a righteous person has life. And so that's just where we left off last week. And so now Paul goes on, and he says, "For the anger of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness." So Paul's saying that God is angry, and he's angry because people are suppressing the truth. All right, so this idea implies that these people know or they sense what the truth is, but they don't want to face it. So they're suppressing it. And the NLT translates this as people who push the truth away from themselves. So it's not just that they do not know or they never really thought about it before. It's not how this works. It's not what we're talking about. These people did think about it. They recognized where all this was headed. They didn't like where it was headed, and so now they're just going to not really engage it. They are deliberately suppressing this. And so why would anyone suppress the truth? All right, well, we're going to come back to that a little bit later in more detail. I'm going to keep reading right now. He says that the fact is that because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. All right, this passage says that everybody that's able to think at all has it evident within them, that which is known about God. And God makes sure that that's true. He says that, for one thing, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. All right, so through what has been made, he says. And what he means is that you can look out at nature or out at the world and you're seeing something that should clearly tell us that this is not an accident. Okay, we can infer and we can deduce these invisible attributes of God and the power of God and what he is like from the things that we see around us. And this is true if you're like a grade school student or like the world's greatest scholar. Okay, it doesn't matter where you live or how you were raised. This is evident to everyone. He says that it is clearly seen. And he says that because of this, people are without excuse. Okay, so he's saying that if you can tell that God must exist from what you can see in the world, then there must be some response that you can make. And that is, even if you've never seen the Bible, okay, never heard of Jesus Christ. And there are indications all through the Bible that this does happen. Okay, people do find God from general revelation. And really what we're looking at here is an argument from design. Okay, Paul is saying that when you look at the design of the world and the things in the world, then you must conclude that there must be a God. There's too much precision in the way that things line up. In order for us to have the universe that we have, things have to be exactly as they are. All right, it's just too unlikely that this would happen by accident. And I'm not going to get too deep into the argument of fine-tuning specifically this morning. I'm going to do a different kind of argument from design, and so I'm going to focus this morning just on the idea of life as it is on earth, right? Just that life exists is what we're talking about. And before we get too deep, let me just say that the argument from design, I think, is super persuasive. There are some arguments against it from scholars, and you should look at those yourself. But today is an argument for the idea of design because I'm the one with the microphone. Okay? And so lots of people, even those that have come to faith, have some doubts and they have some questions. And so this argument from design can help with some of those questions and some of those doubts. And so these arguments can help solidify faith on an intellectual level. And so you don't actually need to turn your brain off to believe in the God of the Bible. And the first proposition of the argument from design is that the presence of design implies the presence of a designer. So this is not a terribly controversial point, okay? So the controversy comes from the question of what exactly constitutes design. Okay, so that's where the rub is in this issue. What is design? Are we imagining that this whole thing is designed by looking at it like backwards? How do we determine if things are really designed or not? And the historically traditional way to make this argument is with a wristwatch and a jar. And, you know, like I'm into mechanical watches, and so this is a legit argument. But we're a different kind of place than that. And so this is a photograph of one of my Glock 19s. And it's really just field stripped, and then the slide is disassembled. All right, so there are 11 pieces and assemblies there, and they're dropped into a plastic bin. And so I cleaned the parts, and it was time to put it all back together. And so I just started to shake the bin that all the pieces were in. And the pieces are colliding with one another. And like, keep in mind that these are pieces that are already crafted to fit together perfectly. Okay, this isn't random junk thrown in a plastic bin. Okay, I know that these pieces already fit together. And so the question is, how long did I shake this bin in order to get this thing back together? Yeah, right? It's a ridiculous question, isn't it? You all know that I didn't shake this bin for very long before I was like, yeah, this doesn't work. Okay, and so if we're honest, we would all come to the almost immediate conclusion that this gun is never going to reassemble itself. Okay, and so even though a designer has already been at work crafting these parts to fit together, it's not going to happen that it will assemble itself by chance into a functioning machine. Okay, I can shake the bin faster so that there are more collisions. I could take apart another Glock 19 and throw the pieces in there to give it more chances to get the right pieces together. But the fact is that all of us know that if it ever did start to look like a firearm, we still wouldn't rely on it to function. Okay, the pieces of this thing are going to turn to dust before it becomes a functioning machine. Okay, it will never happen. It's just not how things work. And you know this intuitively. Even just these 11 pieces that are already made to fit together, all right? It's not going to happen that they're going to assemble themselves in the proper way, in the proper order to make this thing work. And so the argument of the side that does not believe in a designer is this. They take a look at the machine, and because they do not believe in a designer, the fact that there is a machine there insists that no matter how implausible the random assembly of the machine is, it must be the case because there's no alternative. They just imagine ways that there are more and more collisions between the parts because somehow that makes it more likely. And so we can all look at this gun and sense that there's design there. Okay, it's a machine that functions. It has been designed. And to assemble it will require information that has been handed down from the designer in one way or another. And so you can pour plenty of energy into the system to assemble the machine. Okay, you can put all the pieces and even the right tools into the system, but it's not enough. You need the energy, you need the right parts, you might need tools, but you also need information. Okay, you need the information for how this thing goes together, and that is completely absent from our little shaking plastic bin model. Okay, it doesn't even take very much information to put this particular machine together. Okay, and really no specialized tools at all. But it's still not happening without that information. Okay, and I think that we all intuitively recognize design. Anybody know what this thing is? Yeah, me neither. It might be for making rope. I don't know. But without the slightest idea what it does, I can tell you that it did not grow on a tree. All right? And nobody just found this thing in the dirt naturally occurring. You don't mine things like this out of the ground. Okay, this is not a naturally occurring thing. This is designed, and it is manufactured. And a thing might be quite simple and still remove all doubt of whether or not it was designed and manufactured. Right? You ever seen a tennis ball? Okay, so I think that we can all see the same thing here, and that is exactly what this passage is saying. So we should be able to recognize the presence of design in the world. And so that's what our second proposition is that our world manifests the presence of design. Okay, and in fact, it manifests design at an extremely high level. And to illustrate that, I'm going to focus on one particular example this morning, and that is abiogenesis. All right, and so abiogenesis is the proposition that some kind of primordial ooze existed at some point. Chemical compounds collided. They combined in various ways, and then they separated, and they recombined in other ways. And eventually, with enough collisions, they hit on the right combination to come to life. And so biological life was generated from non-biological sources in that way. So non-living matter came to life because the correct arrangement for a living molecule just occurred randomly. All right, and so it's a very important question to answer. Is abiogenesis plausible, or is it implausible? Okay, is it believable that this happened? And of course, I'm going to suggest this morning that this is not believable. Okay, it's not plausible, this is not possible, and this is not the way this happened. Okay, in a lot of ways, this morning is sort of a science-based apologetics class with me not pretending to be any kind of scientist. Okay, so I need you to consider a couple of things as we get into this idea. And the first is that, natural selection does not apply to what we're talking about here. Natural selection is what Darwin observed in the Galapagos Islands. All right, this is beneficial mutations and adaptations for greater survivability, stuff like that. The reason that natural selection does not apply to this situation is not because I'm going to try to convince you that natural selection is not real. I think natural selection is real. Okay, I think that Darwinian microevolution has been demonstrated. It's a fact of how the world works. Now, I think that macroevolution, where one species changes into another species, is a whole different story and becomes no more likely at all just because microevolution is a thing. They're completely different propositions. But even though I can think that natural selection is virtually irrefutable, it cannot apply to what we're talking about this morning because we're talking about things that are not alive. Okay, natural selection only applies to organisms that are already alive and reproducing. The organism has to be able to mutate through reproduction, and that would cause some to be more adaptable than others and more survivable than others. But this one only happens once you have life. So non-living compounds, chemical compounds, do not reproduce themselves. So natural selection has nothing to do with this. Okay, no kind of evolution idea has any bearing on what we're talking about. So no matter what your views are on evolution, no matter what your views on God or creation are, you can't use natural selection as an argument for the origin of life. All right? Maybe you're, kind of turned off at this point, right? You already have a Christian worldview. You believe in creation, not evolution. So who cares about any of this stuff? Well, you care. Okay, you care because the world around you does believe in an origin of life that does not include God. And you need to understand what they believe even more clearly than they do. So when you engage with people that do not believe the Bible is true, it's not a very good response to say that the Bible says so. Okay? So you need to understand some of this stuff. Dr. James Coppedge is the author of the book Evolution, Possible or Impossible, and he says that the length of the average protein in the smallest known living thing is at least 400 amino acid links containing more than 7,000 atoms. All right, so we're talking about one protein molecule. This is the basic building block of the smallest units of life on Earth. We're talking about a single-celled life form, and it's made up of proteins, which are made up of amino acids. And so these proteins are extremely complex molecules with a very high degree of specificity in the way that they're assembled. And so that handgun needed to be assembled in a specific way and in a specific order. If you did it another way, it might look somewhat like a handgun, but it's not going to function like one. And so the same thing is true here in this discussion of proteins. All 7,000 atoms in this very complex and lengthy molecule have to be exactly where they belong. If even one molecule is out of place, you get things like sickle cell anemia. Okay, so one misplaced atom can destroy the functionality of the entire protein. And so these have to be built in a very specific way. And each cell requires millions of protein molecules arranged precisely into dozens of organelles. So these organelles have very specific functions within the cells. And, I don't know how long it's been since you took anything like Bio 101. Okay, but cellular biology, cell biology is very interesting stuff. There are like 20-something organelles in every cell. And an organelle is like a mini organ, serves a function within the cell. A cell is almost like a factory or like a city in there. There are all kinds of things going on all the time. Anything that is alive has to be able to do certain basic things. Okay? It has to be able to take in food and convert that food into energy to power the cell. Also needs to be able to form that food into protein molecules in order to repair and maintain the cell. And there are a huge array of different proteins that need to be synthesized for different parts of the cell. And they all need to be placed right where they belong. And in order to be alive and stay alive, you have to be able to reproduce. So these are the absolute minimum requirements in order to have something that is alive. And all living things have at least, these things here. And so I'm going to try and show a video clip here that primarily deals with the idea of protein synthesis and reproduction inside of cells. I know we don't usually do stuff like this, and we're not going to start. Okay, so don't get used to it. The clip is like 5 minutes long. I think it describes this better than I could and with more authority than I could. So the clip is from a guy named Dean Kenyon. He's a world-class scholar in the field of molecular biology. He did not believe in God or creation. And he's on a quest to explain how this abiogenesis could have possibly happened in some sort of like primordial ooze all by itself. In fact, he wrote a book called Chemical Predestination that claims that it was inevitable that proteins and amino acids would spontaneously form. And the story ends up a little bit like Lee Strobel in The Case for Christ. And so an honest examination of the facts leads this guy to God. And so it's a pretty cool story. But this is just one little clip. Okay, so this is from the video production Unlocking the Mysteries of Life. You can watch all the chapters on YouTube. This is chapter 10.
In the years since Kenyon's rejection of chemical evolution, science has revealed the details of an entire system of information processing that bears the hallmarks of intelligent design. With computer animation, we can enter the cell to view this remarkable system at work. After entering the heart of the cell, we see the tightly wound strands of DNA, storehouses for the instructions necessary to build every protein in an organism. In a process known as transcription, a molecular machine first unwinds a section of the DNA helix to expose the genetic instructions needed to assemble a specific protein molecule. Another machine then copies these instructions to form a molecule known as messenger RNA. When transcription is complete, the slender RNA strand carries the genetic information through the nuclear pore complex, the gatekeeper for traffic in and out of the cell nucleus. The messenger RNA strand is directed to a two-part molecular factory called a ribosome. After attaching itself securely, the process of translation begins. Inside the ribosome, a molecular assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell and then linked into chains often hundreds of units long. Their sequential arrangement determines the type of protein manufactured. When the chain is finished, it is moved from the ribosome to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape critical to its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is then released and shepherded by another molecular machine to the exact location where it is needed.
This is absolutely mind-boggling to perceive at this scale of size such a finely tuned apparatus, a device that bears the marks of intelligent design and manufacture. And we have the details of an immensely complex molecular realm of genetic information processing. And it's exactly this new realm of molecular genetics where we see the most compelling evidence of design on the Earth.
All right. So it worked. Give a round of applause for the tech booth back there. So how about that, right? I don't know how much of that you followed, but I do think that it's interesting that a guy like Kenyon comes to this kind of conclusion. Okay, so, and a lot of this is relatively modern science compared to like when the idea of a single-celled organism being where life came from, just sort of spontaneously springing to life. When that was first put out there, the single-celled organism was believed to be a fairly simple machine. Okay, like really nothing to it. But we absolutely know now that this is just not the case. Okay, it is an enormously complex mechanism. And our knowledge of how complex it is fairly new. I mean, not really new, but compared to the idea that single-celled organisms would arise from nothing, it's very new. But as we learn how complex it is, many people are reluctant to face the fact that they may need to reevaluate their ideas on the origin of life. Okay, so Kenyon looked at this very honestly, and he had to change everything about what he believed. I mean, like, look at the stuff that was on the screen, right? So the very first living cell would have to be capable of self-propagation and feeding itself and protein fabrication and energy production. Okay, all of that would have to be there. Okay, so like science is not quite as popular an area of study as it used to be, but every living cell on the planet is this way. There are no examples of living cells that do not have all of these mechanisms. And a lot of research has been done on just how simple a cell could be and still be alive. And the conclusion has been that even the most ridiculously simple living cell has to have just about all of these processes present within it. All right. And so it doesn't have less processes in it than more complex organisms do. All right. There's just not that much wiggle room in the cell. And so it's worth taking a class on this stuff. If you're very interested in the subject, you could at least do your own internet research if you wanted to. The organelles that are in every living cell are very specialized. Okay, I have all these silly graphics that, like I could try to use to explain the same things that the video clip just did a better job of, but I'm not going to. Okay, the real point is that these structures are so elaborate that they make the little twirly thing with the handle that I put up there, or my Glock, look stupid simple. Okay, every single part of this process that you look at is more and more complex and more amazing. Okay, and if there's any substantial difference between, what we're looking at in living cells and in my Glock, it's that the handgun is by comparison primitive and almost cartoonish in how simple it is. Okay, not a single person would come to the conclusion that the Glock just sprang up spontaneously and that there was no intelligent hand in its design. And yet we're somehow willing to take this thing that is magnitudes of order more complex and that demonstrate design at a much more obvious level and call it a chance occurrence. All right? So you may not have understood all that we just went through, and you probably didn't get to read all of the silly little diagrams on the slides that I just went through. But here's the point, okay? Don't miss this part. All of these things and all of these processes have to be present in the very first cell all at once, okay? It would do no good at all to have part of this stuff. All of the processes have to be there and functioning before you could even have the first replicating cell. Has to be able to do all these things, or life lasts about 30 seconds. Okay, and it's been demonstrated that amino acids will not order themselves into meaningful proteins without information. Information must be present. And information is something that nobody thinks can come about by accident. Okay? It's the information that's contained in the DNA molecule that makes all of this possible. And if you must have DNA before you can have life, then you have a sure sign of design. Okay? DNA is an absolutely genius molecule. It's a sure sign of design if anything is. And to put together matter in such a way that it can reproduce itself and that it can adapt to better fit its environment is pretty extraordinary. Okay, but we've got to see that the information has got to come first. And do not forget that we are outside the envelope of natural selection. Okay, that cannot apply to anything that's not alive. So we're looking at intelligent design with almost no other way to account for how this could come about. So, chance collisions cannot account for this. All right, you wouldn't believe that about the gun. You wouldn't believe it about a watch. You wouldn't believe it about the, hook and gear and handle thing. How could you possibly believe it about this? And so I think that every single person that would look honestly at this would know in their heart that this isn't an accident. Okay, the chances that this happened by accident is like essentially no chance at all. And some of the more honest scientists will absolutely admit this. Okay, but to many of them, the fact that there is life and there's not a God is all the proof that they need to say that it did arise spontaneously. Okay, some of them will seriously say things like, aliens must have seeded the DNA onto this planet because the information had to come from somewhere. And for them, aliens is a more plausible or palatable source of life than God is. and they're willing to just like pretend that aliens don't have to be created by somebody. Okay, so this is the equivalent of, me taking a look at my handgun and deciding beforehand that I don't believe in Gaston Glock. And so since there is no Gaston Glock and there is a gun, the gun must have sprang up spontaneously. No matter how unlikely that is, must have happened because here's the gun. Okay, and since it's so unlikely for this to happen, I'm going to invent some kind of like multiverse theory where the chance collisions are infinite so that I can reconcile the fact that even though it's impossible for guns to spring into being, this one did. Okay, so chance collision is just not how things get put together. Okay, it's not how things work, and you know it. All right, so the point is that we do see plenty of compelling evidence for design in our world, right down to the molecular level. And the design is fairly incompatible with like natural cause and effect. So it's design that would have to be implanted by a designer. And so if the presence of design implies a designer, and if our world does manifest design, then therefore a designer must exist. Okay, reasoning seems pretty solid to me, but that's not it. All right, there's a little bit more. It's not just that a designer exists. It's also that this designer has to be sufficient to account for the design that we see. So it turns out that we can infer certain things about the designer from what we see in the design. Okay, that's what this passage is talking about here. So in the first place, we can infer vast intelligence to come up with just the design of the things that we've looked at this morning. Okay, so 4 chemicals combined in different orders, helixed around one another, and then it'll just like open up and duplicate itself like a little assembly line. Pretty smart guy came up with that idea. Okay, with nothing that we know of for inspiration at all. So the designer will also have to have will or intent. So some people or worldviews imagine that there is a God, but he's more like a life force kind of thing, right? Like gravity or the Force from Star Wars. Okay, it just kind of pervades all things and is all around us, and we're all part of it. And that wouldn't really explain what we're looking at here. Okay, we need something that can think and form an intent. And so whatever God is, it has forethought, it has planning, and then it can go out and execute that plan. So that's what we see in the reality of the world around us. And these are all elements that come with something that we call personality. Okay, this is a personal being that we're talking about. It's not a thing. It's not a principle like gravity or electromagnetic attraction or whatever. Okay, this is a being that can think and plan and execute according to a specific intent. Talking about a personal designer here. And that rules out a bunch of the speculations that people have come up with through the ages. Okay, we can see immense power that this stuff must take. And I'm not talking about abiogenesis. This is the entire magnitude of what we can see. And so this comes pretty close to suggesting infinitude. Okay, so if this designer created all things, then this designer predates those things, and in fact must predate everything that we know. This designer is the uncaused first cause. And so if there's something that has always been there, then it must be this designer. Now, that's a little bit of a stretch without the context of the Bible. Okay, but it is a reasonable conclusion. And I do think that this can come pretty close to inferring infinitude. So we have a pretty close picture of an infinite and personal God. And when you look at the religions of the world, There are thousands of different religions in the world, but they do break down into certain categories. Okay, and there are only a handful of categories. There's like polytheism or animism. And so these posit that there are thousands of gods that animate nature and everything else. There's pantheism, which posits a God that is in all and through all, and that all things are a part of God, and that God is sort of like an impersonal mass or whatever. And then there's theism, which is the belief that an infinite and personal God, right, is out there somewhere. And so some people call this monotheism, but I actually think that that's sort of implied by the fact that this God is infinite. So between these three views, this takes care of most every single religious worldview. Okay, those are your choices. Polytheism or animism does have personal gods, okay, but they're not infinite. They can be tricked, okay, they make mistakes. You can even come to control some of the gods in these kinds of religious systems, and so they're a lot like overgrown humans. Pantheism poses a God who is infinite, but it's not personal. And that means that neither one of these categories of religious thought will account for what we see in general revelation. So we need a designer that is infinite and personal. All right, and we only find that in three significant world religions: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And that's a little bit interesting, because all three of those religions are linked because all three of them draw their origin from the same book. Okay, so maybe that's not an accident. Maybe that book is the place that you might find the real answers to life's meaningful questions. Okay, so no one else came up with an idea like this one. So we're going to talk about special revelation in a different week. That's what the Bible is. But God is infinite, and he is personal. There are other things about God that you can deduce from general revelation, and we're going to do some more of them next week. And Paul says that all of this stuff has been understood through what has been made. Okay, all of these things about God we should know just from looking at stuff. It's very cool. Let's get back to the previous verse. Remember this one, it says people suppress the truth in unrighteousness. People will look straight at the facts, but they don't want to accept them, so they suppress the truth. They come up with their own thing that they would rather believe instead. And no matter how much evidence you give them, some people would, for some reason, rather not believe in an infinite personal God. They may believe in a God of their own making that is more suited to being the God that they want to believe in, but the actual God who is really there, they want no part of, so they will suppress the truth. And the reason that people would do something like that has to do with the fact that people are frightened by the idea of God. Okay? They think that if there is an infinite personal God, then they're just a creature in someone else's creation. They're no longer the master of the universe that they live in. God may actually have some say on how I spend my life, how I spend my time. All right? People are just not sure that they want anything to do with that idea. People are not sure that they're comfortable thinking about this kind of thing, so it just must not be the case. Makes God mad. That's what this says. It's because we're being dishonest when we think this way. Okay, we're saying that we sense what might be true, but we're going to refuse to look at it. And that's dishonest. We have enough information right in front of us to know that he's there. And we're pretending like, I don't know, man. I'm just not sure. We do know. You are sure. You just don't like it. Does your dog look away when you're making an evil eye at it, right? Like your dog turns and, right? That's the picture that comes into my head. You're being dishonest with yourself and with God. Makes him mad. All right, so that's what the very first line up there in this verse says. And a person with integrity, when they saw something that looked like it may be true, might have the guts to explore it and to act on it. That means that we would follow the implications, whatever they may be. All right, and so if this is the way that reality is, then you may as well get on board with it and face the real deal. All right, so we don't actually get a vote in the way that the universe works. Okay, so we're not making this stuff up. We are observing how it does work and aligning our thinking and our beliefs with what is. Okay, so it is what it is. So we need to have the guts to face what it is. And God wants us to have the integrity to call out to him. And so if we can realize that he is probably there, and you may be feeling something like that right now, then we should have the integrity to face the real God. Okay, and you need to say that if he's there and if he's personal and if this business about the good news is real, then you need to ask him to reveal all that stuff to you. If it's true that God is there and he's personal and that he made a way to forgive you and bring you into communion with him forever, then you need to be all over this. Okay, you need to be checking this stuff out. And so, like whatever business deal you're working on or video game you're playing or room you're decorating, it is not more important than getting this thing settled. Okay, the only response that has personal integrity is to settle if this is real or not. Okay, if you just decide not to look at this carefully, then you fall into this category of suppressing the truth. And no quarter at all will be given you. Okay, you have the opportunity to know. All right, so in chapter 10 of the book of Romans, we'll see Paul say that anyone who calls out to the name of the Lord will be rescued. Okay, God is not going to be unsure if he wants to rescue even you if you call out to him. He's not reluctant to rescue you. You turn to him and he is all over it. Okay, God died. He paid a huge price so that he could be with you. He's into it. I promise he loves you. Okay, so what good reason is there for not checking this out right now? Tomorrow is not better than today for this. All right, and of course there is something that rankles a little bit about this. We don't really want to grovel. Okay, we like calling the shots in our own lives. And truthfully, I think that, pride is the biggest barrier that we have. We have this intense pride where we're just convinced that we don't have to bow to anybody and that no one should be able to tell us what to do. And that's the real reason that we suppress the truth. And so it's no wonder that that ticks God off after all that he's done and all that he's offered you. Okay, we turn our noses up and we act like, we've got a better idea out of pride. Give me a break, dude. This is weak. You say you have doubts? Fine. You may always have some doubts. I would suggest that you cannot remove some doubts about anything. And yet, you take action on all kinds of things. So take some action. All right? You say that, I just don't feel it. You're right. You should just wait until you feel like doing something in order to do it. When's the next time that you're going to go to work or take out the garbage or discipline your kids? Okay, you don't need to feel anything. You need to just do the thing that has some integrity to it. All right, so just check it out. It doesn't get any easier by putting it off. It actually gets harder. by putting it off. The more used to putting it off you get, you become accustomed to manufacturing excuses for suppressing the truth. It's called hardening your heart. Okay. So next week, we're going to look at the fact that this argument from design is not the only reason that we're given. Okay, and so when we're into this area of general revelation, this is just one thing. There are actually several others. And many people think that these other reasons to believe are even more powerful than this one. So we're going to take a little bit of time and look at these and think through them. I actually think that these arguments can be helpful. They can help you in talking to people with other worldviews, and they can help you to get your head around your own faith sometimes. A lot of people never heard this stuff before. So next week, we're going to do what's called the presuppositional argument. It's one of my favorites. It's good stuff. It's a little bit complicated, and I like that. These are not super simplistic arguments that we're making. All right, these things have some weight. So they're important. And so come back for that if you can on Christmas Eve. But that's all.